You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm back here with Radu Venter. He is a critical care flight paramedic based in Canada. He goes under the pseudonym of Paramedic Philosopher on Substack. Radu, welcome to the podcast.
Happy to be here.
Today, we're going to really tackle one of your fantastic blog posts, which is really seeing the forest beyond the tree and just looking at the interconnected nature of the healthcare system, really. Just looking also just how complex and cooperative the network of healthcare needs to be. Could I get you to really sort of speak to why you wrote the blog?
Yeah, for sure. As with all my posts, it's a lot of kind of personal experience matched with a little bit of just kind of reflection on the system as a whole, and and specifically the kind of the main moment where this piece started from was the organ harvest that I refer to in it, where um, I was fortunate enough to, when I was on an ICU rotation, they had a patient there who was going to be the they were termed brain dead. The organ harvest was going to be scheduled later that day, so naturally I attached myself to that and begged to follow along as far as I could. And they said, "Well, we'll do our best," but there was quite a line of others that were interested in following the case through. But luckily, I was able to kind of sit in on it at the end and watch as this entire team worked together to basically keep this person alive for as long as possible so that they could confirm potential donors, confirm how to get the parts from here to where they need to go and how to coordinate. All of that was just a mammoth undertaking. And it wasn't until I was standing in the operating room watching, the actual harvest taking place that I was suddenly struck by just how massive the healthcare system is. And in a sense, we know it because, oh, well, that's a really big hospital. There's a lot of people in there. But it's not until you can actually see this entire process in action that you suddenly realize, oh, for this one person, there was a massive team taking care of them for the day. And for every one of the organs that were harvested, each and every one of them is going to another person who is being cared for by at least that many people as well. And before we even get into kind of the long-term care considerations of somebody who's received a transplant, these are individuals who will be interacting with so many healthcare staff. And how interesting it is to see this and to kind of compare it from the paramedic perspective, because we are a very, very small percentage of that. Not that we're not all very important cogs in the machine, the kind of the chain of life that the ACLS protocol talks about is very much so relevant. So it's not to say that any part is more important or less important than others. It's realizing how it all comes together as a whole. So um, unfortunately for paramedics, we don't get to see a lot of that because for many of us, our interaction ends at the emergency department. And in a lot of cases, we don't actually really get to see a lot of the emergency department because we're just waiting to drop off our patient into a room. And so we don't get to see the amount of time that is spent with the patient, the amount of individuals that interact with the patient. Um, and we're kind of in a sense, almost a neglected child. And and at times I've seen in a lot of paramedics this kind of frustration that, oh, you know, we're just as important as the other hospital staff, we're just not seen. And there's an element of truth to that, but I think there's also an element of recognizing the kind of the humility that's necessary to say, yes, I am important, but I'm just a small, small fraction of all of the steps that will be required for this person to go from the moment they called 911 to the moment they're back home and maybe require the minimum, the barest minimum of ongoing care for whatever this emergency happened to be. And it's unfortunate that for me, this moment came when I have to say, I think about 6 years into my practice. So it's a very one, it's a very rare and very humbling moment, but it's also one that we can't guarantee that people will get. And so I think it's trying to figure out how best can we show paramedics, but also the whole system. Let's look at all these small parts and let's look at the value and the role and the importance of all the interconnectedness and realizing how, every one of us plays such an important role.
To your point, really, in the blog post, a greater exchange and understanding between pre-hospital and hospital staff benefits the entire system. And also to your point, Radu, having more preceptorship or indeed rotations in hospital gets you to understand, because I think to be a practitioner which understands the system, you have to understand the next level or indeed the next care chain to almost understand the ceiling of care that you can provide and the appreciation of that whole patient journey. And actually, understanding the next system or the system after that, so the surgical system after the ED system, you can appreciate all the more, the interventions that you're delivering to the patient, to your point, to perfuse the kidneys, to perfuse the brain, to perfuse the lungs, to understand what level of surgical intervention that patient is then going to receive. And I think that the more interaction and the more we can be exposed, to your point, around the next level and ceiling, it gives credence and power and importance and the why you're doing what you're doing right now. So it kind of contextualizes the role a lot more when you appreciate the next chain and the next chain and even the next chain after that, the rehabilitation chain or the convalescence chain. But have you, just before we hear the blog, have you had any indeed either feedback or thoughts on the blog since you wrote it?
Having interacted a few times with doctors and with other healthcare professionals, there seems to be much more of a willingness, it seems, from those professions to get more of an understanding of our profession than I've potentially seen in paramedics in kind of the other direction. And it's very unfortunate because I think there is so much that could potentially be gained from all of these other professions and all of these other specialties, especially since a paramedic is kind of a catch-all. We're an anesthesiologist with nowhere near the practice or the training. We're emergency specialists. We dabble in pretty much everything. But the time we have with the patient and our level of interventions is so limited that it'd be nice to interact with more of these specialties and get kind of an understanding of, okay, well, why is it that we go with this approach pre-hospitally? Oh, well, maybe it's because the medications don't last as long, so it's easier to work around if they need to once we get to the hospital, or, oh, these are just the best bang for the buck medications, or these are the most diverse, guaranteed to work on most patients with minimal complication. And I think that bringing those kinds of that kind of knowledge and experience with these interactions within the hospital service as a whole brings about such an extra level of understanding and appreciation for what we can do and what we could be able to do.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. You listen, it's a fantastic blog. You'll be able to read it in the show notes. You're just about to hear it in AI format. Radu, it's always a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you've ever had to interact with the healthcare system, maybe for a checkup or, something more serious, you probably know it feels less like a simple visit and more like walking through, I don't know, a huge forest. You see the one thing right there in front of you, your doctor, maybe your nurse, that one appointment, that's your specific tree, but the rest, the massive coordinated system keeping it all going, that's the forest. And it often stays hidden.
And understanding the hidden forest is, well, it's pretty crucial. Today, we're doing a deep dive based on some really interesting reflections. They come from someone who is deeply rooted in their own tree, a specialized healthcare practitioner, a paramedic, specifically, who kind of have this eye-opening moment, realize just how much complex activity they were missing out on simply because of how their job was structured.
Yeah, we pulled this insight from an observer who wrote about their experiences, first in pre-hospital settings, like on the ambulance, and then, this is key, during a hospital practicum, which gave him a totally different view.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to zoom out a bit. We want to uncover the honestly extreme level of cooperation that patient care needs, We'll look at how specialization creates both incredible skill, but also these necessary blind spots, and ultimately explore why getting this bigger picture, this whole system view, really benefits everyone, whether you work in healthcare or, you're a patient. Okay, so to really grasp the scale of this healthcare machine, we should start where our observer did. They described witnessing an event during their hospital practicum that they called awe-inspiring, an organ harvest. Now that sounds incredibly dramatic, almost like something from TV. Why use such a rare, intense event to define the everyday system?
Well, what's fascinating and maybe counterintuitive is that the drama of the organ harvest, it just magnifies the sheer scale of interdependence that's happening all the time, every single day. We tend to think coordination is maybe a few people chatting, but this kind of process, it involves dozens of highly specialized roles, all operating at the same time across different places, different timelines. It's really complex.
Okay, walk us through that chain reaction then, because it sounds like it's way more than just this surgical team in the OR, right?
Far more, yeah. Think about just the preparation. Way before that patient even gets near the operating room. You've got phlebotomists taking blood work, sometimes running tests multiple times an hour. Those results, they go straight to doctors who are interpreting them, ordering specific therapies. At the same time, you have pharmacists, maybe down in the basement pharmacy, compounding and shipping up new medications needed right then for stability. And nurses are right there at the bedside, starting those treatments, watching vital signs minute by minute.
And you often have respiratory therapists involved too, right? Managing the ventilator, that's a whole specialty itself.
Exactly. And then you layer on the logistics of the organ itself. You've got the organ transplant team, they're confirming recipients, dealing with complex matching protocols, juggling schedules across maybe multiple hospitals.
Wow.
Yeah, and the coordination isn't just inside the hospital walls. Look at the transport teams that come in, often specialized air transport units. They're moving these organs nationally. So you're talking about critical handoffs happening in the operating room, then maybe on a highway, then maybe at an airport tarmac, all linked by really tight communication protocols and, this shared goal.
Wait a second, are you saying this whole elaborate dance, this ballet, it only happens for something super rare like an organ harvest? Or is this level of coordination actually standard for really sick patients?
It is the standard. That is the absolute key takeaway here. Whether it's that organ harvest or managing a patient who came in with, say, severe sepsis or a stroke or a really complicated fracture, that level of minute-by-minute multi-team interaction, that makes up the majority of their healthcare experience once they're admitted. The complexity of just managing sepsis, for instance, needs that same kind of timing and teamwork. Pharmacists prepping drugs hours ahead, while the respiratory therapist is making tiny adjustments moment by moment. No single person, no single unit, no matter how skilled, operates alone here. This huge interdependent system. That's the forest.
Okay, so that system is vast, incredibly coordinated. Let's contrast that now with the single, very defined role that gave us these insights, the tree.
Right. So the practitioner providing these reflections is a paramedic, and they use that organ harvest example perfectly to show their own roles' sort of boundaries in that massive orchestrated effort we just described. The paramedic's part was described as, and I quote, brief, specialized, and separate. Their main job in that scenario was basically logistics, driving the organs from the hospital to the airport, or maybe from the airport to the receiving hospital.
And that brings us to their core specialization, which I think people outside of, emergency services often misunderstand. Paramedics are essentially transport specialists.
Precisely. That's the heart of it. Their training, their skills, they're all prioritized entirely for that role. Dealing with what can be a really hectic, chaotic scene outside the hospital's controlled environment, assessing immediate life threats, providing symptom relief quickly. The main goal is always a smoother, safer transport to where the definitive care happens in the hospital.
Right. And because the goal is transport, their focus isn't necessarily on the long game of the patient's condition.
And that highlights a really critical nuance the source brought up. Few, if any, of the treatments a paramedic provides are purely definitive. They're not the final cure, usually. They're managing an acute crisis, stabilizing the patient for the journey. That patient is always going to get more assessment, more diagnostics, long-term care once they arrive. You can say the paramedic saves life in the moment, but it's the hospital system that manages the underlying condition, provides the longer-term recovery plan.
Okay, so the job demands this intense focus on immediate threats, the critical life-saving stuff. But that hyper-focus on emergent transport, it inherently means they miss the rest of the forest hiding behind our tree, as the source put it. And this limited view can actually create some friction, some misunderstandings.
Absolutely. It creates these cognitive blind spots that are frankly built into the structure of the job. We see a perfect example in an anecdote the source shared. It's about the common scenario.
Yeah.
A frustrated paramedic who gets annoyed because the nurse taking the patient report at the hospital doesn't seem to have the patient's entire story memorized right when they roll in.
Oh, I can totally picture that tension. The paramedic's thinking, come on, I just spent the last hour keeping this person alive and you haven't even looked at the chart yet.
Exactly. And that's where the structure of the system blinds them a bit. The paramedic is operating for that short time with an incredibly privileged ratio, one patient. For that hour, or however long transport takes, that single patient is their whole focus, their entire universe. But they are the exception in the hospital setting. The nurse receiving that report, they're likely managing 5, 6, maybe 7 other complex patients simultaneously. They might have another patient crashing in the next room, or they're dealing with a critical medication that just arrived, or fielding calls from 3 different specialists about other patients.
Right. So the aha moment isn't that the nurse isn't paying attention or doesn't care. It's that the system they work in makes real-time, deep memorization of every single detail for every patient just impossible. They have to rely on charts, handover notes, the specialist teams they coordinate.
It's a classic case of prospective failure, isn't it? We've all done it. Fixated on our task, totally unaware of the pressures on the other person. And beyond that, the paramedics' necessary focus on acute emergent problems. It really limits their day-to-day exposure and deep understanding of chronic health conditions. The long-term management stuff.
Can you give us a concrete example of that limitation?
Sure. The source points out they might be incredibly skilled, expertly suited to handle a suspected heart attack, managing that immediate crisis with total precision. But that same paramedic would likely be, quoting again, unable to identify the kind of infection a patient may have and the correct antibiotic therapy to initiate. That complex diagnostic thinking, understanding which antibiotic works for which bug, dealing with resistance, managing organ failure over days or weeks. That's the forest work. And the paramedic's tree, their role, doesn't usually give them that long-term view needed for that kind of decision. Their training is all about the start of the journey, not the marathon.
So what we have are these 2 highly skilled, super specialized groups, pre-hospital teams and hospital teams. They're essential partners, obviously, but they often operate with these significant misunderstandings, simply because they don't have enough sustained, meaningful overlap. They're kind of isolated by their own expertise.
That isolation, it does have a cost. Brief trips into the emergency department for handover or the occasional patient transfer between facilities. It just doesn't give the paramedic enough time to really absorb the incredible intricacy of how a hospital runs day to day. They don't see the nurse juggling that huge patient load all shift, or the doctor in endless coordination meetings planning long-term care. And, conversely, those hospital folks, they rarely get to experience the chaos, the urgency, the resource limits that are just normal out in the field on the ambulance.
The source material suggests a potential solution here, a way to bridge this gap. It talks about fostering exchange. The idea being, if practitioners could somehow share more in each other's roles and responsibilities. The quote was, "Imagine how much better we could understand each other." But in a system that's already stretched so thin on time and resources, is that really practical? Is it just a nice idea that can't happen?
That's a really valid point of fair skepticism. Implementing formal, extensive rotations, that takes time, it takes money, things the system often doesn't have to spare. But I think the core principle behind it is what's really important. And that principle doesn't just apply to medicine. It applies to any complex field.
Like what? Give me another example.
Okay, think about, say, large-scale engineering or logistics. Maybe you work on a highly specialized engineering team, designing one specific component for a huge project. You are that paramedic in this analogy. You're essential. You're excellent at your specific task, your tree.
Right.
But you inherently miss the big picture of scheduling complexities, maybe supply chain shortages hitting another team, the budget constraints the finance department is wrestling with, the forest.
Okay. So the goal of this exchange isn't necessarily to make everyone an expert in everything else. It's more about building systemic empathy, understanding the pressures and perspectives of the other parts of the machine.
Exactly. That's the core benefit. And this deep dive, hopefully, gives you, the listener, some of that broader perspective without you having to actually do a hospital rotation yourself. The ultimate payoff for the practitioner, or really anyone trying to navigate complexity, is self-awareness. By understanding the whole system better, the whole forest, we get a much clearer picture of ourselves, our own role within it. It shines a light on our limitations, like why a paramedic doesn't know the intricacies of long-term antibiotic therapy, just as much as it highlights our strengths, why they are the best person to save a life on the side of the road.
This has been a really fascinating look into a system that absolutely requires specialization to even function, but one that clearly suffers when that specialization turns into isolation. We've talked about the vast, coordinated forest, the whole healthcare system, maybe best shown by that organ harvest example with its huge cast of cooperating roles.
Right. And we've contrasted that with the essential but highly specialized tree, the individual role, like the transport specialist paramedic, whose intense focus creates these necessary blind spots, especially around things like chronic care or the pressures others face in the system. And the big takeaway is that understanding that whole system, that forest, is really key to understanding your own strengths, your own limitations, and how you can best contribute.
So here's maybe a final thought for you to consider. If highly trained experts within the system, people like paramedics, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, can struggle to fully grasp the entirety of the patient journey, if they struggle to see the whole forest because of their necessary focus on their own tree, then what does that imply for you when you walk into that system as a patient? Someone often without any professional training in navigating this incredibly complex forest.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? It really underscores that the complexity we've discussed, it demands more than just, better technology or more funding. It demands from everyone involved, from the phlebotomist drawing blood to the specialist surgeon to the patient advocate, and yes, even the patient themselves, a real investment in systemic empathy and just relentless curiosity about how all the pieces fit together. Your small piece of the puzzle, your tree, is only truly valuable because of the thousands of other specialized pieces, those other trees, that you might rarely, if ever, actually see.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.